Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Easy English Spark channel. I'm so happy to have you here with us today. Get ready to supercharge your English listening and speaking skills as we explore some essential strategies that will help you build confidence and speak more fluently. In today's episode, we'll be diving into a key part of your language journey: how to push through obstacles, maintain consistency, and make steady progress toward mastering English. So let's spark up your English journey and make it brighter than ever before. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The First Step. Hello, everyone. My name is Selena, and I'm here to share my journey of learning English with you. It's been an incredibly important experience for me, and I truly believe that learning a new language opens up a world of opportunities. Whether it's for education, career growth, or connecting with people from all around the globe. I first realized the significance of learning English when I started to think about the doors it could open for me. English is considered the global language for many fields. It's the language of business, science, technology, and entertainment. By learning English, I could not only improve my career prospects, but also connect with a diverse range of people from different cultures. At first, I was intimidated by the idea. I knew that learning a new language would take time and effort, and I didn't know where to begin. But then I thought about the benefits. I realized that the challenges I would face along the way would only be temporary, and the long-term rewards would make all the effort worth it. It was not going to be easy, but I was ready to dive in. So I took the first step. I set a clear goal. I want to learn English, and I want to be able to communicate with people from all over the world. With that goal in mind, I felt a sense of purpose and motivation. But then came the question, where do I start? I decided to focus on the basics. The first thing I did was immerse myself in the language as much as I could. I started by watching English movies and listening to songs in English. Even if I didn't understand everything, I would listen carefully, trying to catch a few words here and there. It was like stepping into a completely new world, full of excitement, yet filled with confusion at times. I wasn't sure if I was doing it right, but I trusted that this was part of the process. I also began with the most practical and essential step: vocabulary. I knew that to communicate, I had to learn basic words and phrases that would allow me to introduce myself, ask for directions, or have simple conversations. I started with everyday words, things like book, water, food, house. At first, it seemed like there were endless words to learn, and it was easy to get overwhelmed. But I realized that the key was to take small steps and stay consistent. Every new word I learned brought me one step closer to my goal. In addition to vocabulary, I started learning how to pronounce words correctly. English pronunciation was difficult for me at first because many words sounded so different from what I expected. Some words seemed to have silent letters, while others had unusual stress patterns. But I kept practicing, listening to native speakers, and repeating what I heard. Slowly, I started to notice improvement in how I spoke. Another crucial part of the first step was understanding the importance of patience. I quickly realized that learning a language isn't something that happens overnight. It requires time and a consistent effort. There were times when I felt frustrated, when I couldn't understand a word or a sentence, or when I mixed up words and couldn't find the right ones. But every time I felt discouraged, I reminded myself of my goal. I was learning English to open up opportunities for myself, and every mistake I made was just another step towards progress. The journey was about more than just memorizing words. It was about changing the way I thought, the way I approached the world. Learning English meant opening up to new ideas, new cultures, and new ways of thinking. It wasn't just about mastering a language. It was about broadening my perspective. This shift in thinking made the process even more exciting. To make the learning process more engaging, I started finding ways to incorporate English into my daily life. I labeled items around the house with their English names. For example, I wrote fridge on my refrigerator and mirror on my bathroom mirror. These simple actions helped me associate English words with everyday objects. I also made a habit of listening to English songs with simple lyrics that I could sing along to. It wasn't just about learning words. It was about feeling the rhythm of the language. At this point, I still didn't feel confident enough to speak English fluently, but I knew I was laying the foundation for something bigger. Each small step I took made me feel more connected to the language, and each new word I learned added to my growing vocabulary. I also noticed that the more I practiced, the easier it became to understand spoken English. Listening to songs and watching movies in English was a huge help. It allowed me to hear the words in context and understand how they were used in different situations. In the beginning, I felt like I was taking tiny steps. But as I continued, I realized that these small actions were building up. They were shaping my learning experience and preparing me for the next stages of the journey. So, I kept going. I stayed focused on my goal, and every day, I took one small step forward. Whether it was learning a new word, listening to a new song, or watching a movie in English, each action was helping me progress. There were challenges along the way. But each time I faced one, I reminded myself that this was all part of the journey. And that's the first step in learning English. Taking action, staying consistent, and being patient with yourself. It might not always feel like progress is happening, but every word you learn, every sentence you understand, and every step you take brings you closer to your goal. Remember, the journey of learning a language is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And every step you take brings you one step closer to fluency. So, let's keep moving forward, one step at a time. Chapter 2: Facing Challenges. As I continued my journey into learning English, it didn't take long for me to realize that it wasn't going to be as easy as I initially thought. In fact, there were times when I felt overwhelmed and frustrated by the many challenges that came my way. But rather than giving up, I decided to embrace these challenges and view them as opportunities for growth. One of the first challenges I encountered was pronunciation. English pronunciation is tricky, to say the least. Unlike my native language, English words often don't sound the way they're written. There were words like though, through, thought, and thorough, which seemed to sound almost identical in speech, but were completely different when written. I found myself getting tangled in the confusion of vowel sounds, silent letters, and stressed syllables. At first, I would hear a word, repeat it aloud, and it would sound nothing like what I was hearing from the native speakers. This frustrated me a lot. How could I possibly communicate effectively if I couldn't pronounce words correctly? But I didn't let this frustration stop me. I realized that pronunciation would take time, and the only way to get better was to keep practicing. I started to listen carefully to how native speakers pronounced words and tried to mimic their pronunciation. I would replay certain sentences, repeating them until I felt more confident. I even used language apps and online resources to help me with pronunciation, listening to audio clips and repeating them over and over. But pronunciation wasn't the only challenge I faced. Grammar was another area where I struggled. English grammar seemed complicated, especially when compared to my native language. I remember feeling completely confused by the concept of tenses. Why did we have so many different ways to describe actions that happened in the past, are happening now, or will happen in the future? Past simple, present perfect, past perfect. These all seemed like unnecessary complications to me at first. For example, I found it especially challenging to know when to use the present perfect tense. I would often hear people say things like, "I've been to London," but I couldn't quite understand why they didn't just say, "I went to London." These differences were subtle but important, and they left me feeling lost. But I knew that if I wanted to improve, I had to face this challenge head on. To tackle grammar, I began to break things down into smaller, more manageable pieces. Instead of trying to understand everything at once, I focused on one concept at a time. I used grammar workbooks and online resources that explained the rules clearly, and I practiced a lot through exercises. I also watched English learning videos that explained grammar concepts in simple ways. Over time, I started to feel more comfortable with the different tenses, though I still made mistakes. Another area where I struggled was with vocabulary. In English, there always seemed to be so many words to learn. I would look at a word, think, I understood it, but then realize it had multiple meanings, depending on the context. For example, the word bark could mean the sound a dog makes, or it could refer to the outer layer of a tree. How was I supposed to remember all of these words and their different meanings? It felt like an endless task. I had to come to terms with the fact that vocabulary learning would take a lot of time. I couldn't expect to master every word all at once. I started using flashcards and made a habit of reviewing them every day. I would write down new words, their meanings, and example sentences. I also read a lot, making sure to note down unfamiliar words as I encountered them. Gradually, I started building my vocabulary, but it wasn't easy. There were also moments when I felt like I wasn't making any progress at all. I would study for hours, only to realize that I still couldn't have a full conversation in English or understand everything I was listening to. This made me feel disheartened. It was easy to fall into a mindset of frustration, but I had to remind myself that language learning isn't linear. There would be times of rapid improvement, followed by times of stagnation, and that was okay. Another tough challenge I faced was dealing with self-doubt. At times, I would question if I was ever going to get better at English. My mistakes, especially in speaking, felt like huge setbacks. I would mix up words, use incorrect grammar, and feel embarrassed in front of others. It wasn't easy to put myself out there and speak a language I wasn't fully confident in. But then I realized that mistakes are a natural part of learning. No one speaks perfectly right away, and the key was to keep trying. I began looking at my mistakes not as failures, but as learning opportunities. Every time I made a mistake, it meant I had something new to work on. I started to embrace these errors, laugh at myself, and learn from them. I also sought out feedback from others. When I joined language exchange programs and conversation clubs, I asked native speakers to correct me when I made mistakes. This helped me grow and feel less afraid of making errors. Through all of these challenges, immersion became one of the most helpful techniques for me. At first, I was hesitant to dive into real-world conversations because I was afraid of making mistakes. But I knew that if I didn't push myself, I would never improve. I started speaking in English as much as I could, even if it was just talking to myself or repeating phrases I had learned. I joined conversation clubs and language exchange programs where I could practice with others. Though it was daunting at first, the more I spoke, the more confident I became. One of the most important things I learned during this phase was that language learning is not just about memorizing words or rules. It's about embracing the process, facing challenges head-on, and pushing through the tough moments. Every obstacle I encountered taught me something new about the language and about myself. It was easy to get discouraged when things weren't going smoothly, but perseverance and consistency were key to overcoming these challenges. Looking back, the challenges I faced in learning English shaped me in ways I hadn't expected. They made me stronger and more determined to succeed. And while I still face obstacles today, I now know that they are just part of the journey. It's all about learning to adapt, to keep moving forward, and to never stop pushing myself. The key takeaway from this chapter is that challenges are inevitable, but they are also part of the learning process. Every mistake and every struggle brings us one step closer to our goal. The important thing is to keep going and stay focused, because with perseverance, the challenges become opportunities for growth. Chapter 3: Overcoming the Basics. Once I had spent some time getting used to the idea of learning English and facing the initial challenges, I began to realize that I was still in the early stages of the journey. While I had mastered a few basic words and phrases, I quickly came to understand that to truly improve, I needed to conquer the foundational aspects of the language. This is where the real work began. Overcoming the basics. The first step in overcoming the basics was understanding the importance of grammar. English grammar, with its rules and structures, seemed a bit intimidating at first. My native language didn't have many of the rules that English did, so learning them felt like trying to put together a puzzle without the picture on the box. But I knew that if I wanted to progress, I had to master these fundamental rules. I remember the first time I encountered subject-verb agreement. It seemed so simple at first, but I often found myself tripping over it. In my native language, the subject and verb always seemed to match naturally, but in English, there were more specific rules to follow. For example, with the verb to be, I had to learn that he is, she is, and it is were correct, while they is or we is were wrong. This may sound like a simple rule, but for someone who's just beginning to learn English, these small things felt complicated. To tackle this, I dedicated time each day to studying grammar workbooks. I would read through explanations and then immediately practice by completing exercises. The more I practiced, the clearer it became. I started with simple sentences and focused on understanding subject-verb agreement, articles like a and the, and basic sentence structures. It wasn't glamorous, and it often felt like a chore, but the more I practiced, the more I started to feel comfortable with these basic concepts. Alongside grammar, building vocabulary was essential. It was one thing to know a few common words, but it was another to be able to express myself fully. At the start, I focused on the most common nouns, verbs, and adjectives like house, eat, big, and small. But as I moved forward, I needed to expand my range and learn words that would allow me to express more complex ideas. One method I used to build my vocabulary was through flashcards. I would write down new words on one side of an index card and their meanings on the other. For example, for the word journey, I wrote, a long trip from one place to another. I made a goal to learn a few new words every day. The key here was repetition, reviewing the words regularly and using them in sentences helped me reinforce them in my memory. Soon, I noticed that I could form sentences more easily. I also started to immerse myself in the language as much as possible. I changed the settings on my phone to English and began to watch more English movies and TV shows, even if I didn't understand everything. I would try to catch words and phrases that I recognized. This helped me see how grammar and vocabulary worked in real-life contexts. Watching these shows helped me hear proper sentence structure and pronunciation in action. I learned new vocabulary through context and repetition. Shows like Friends and The Office became regular parts of my routine because they were not only entertaining, but they also used everyday language that was easy to follow. At the same time, I had to work on my listening skills. In the beginning, understanding spoken English was a huge challenge. Native speakers talked quickly, and their accents made it even more difficult. I remember watching a scene from a TV show and understanding absolutely nothing. But instead of getting discouraged, I repeated the scene, replaying it multiple times. I would pause and rewind to catch certain words or phrases. Over time, I started to pick up more and more. It wasn't perfect at first, but with consistency, my listening skills began to improve. Slowly, I was able to understand short sentences, then full conversations. Reading was another area that required focus. At first, reading in English felt like a slow process. I would read a sentence, get stuck on a word, and have to look it up in a dictionary. But this process was valuable because it helped me learn new words and improve my understanding of sentence structures. I started with children's books. Simple, illustrated stories with easy-to-understand language. They gave me the chance to enjoy reading without feeling too overwhelmed. Books like The Very Hungry Caterpillar and Where the Wild Things introduced me to basic vocabulary and helped me build confidence. As my confidence grew, I moved on to slightly more complex texts, such as young adult novels. I found that reading became easier, and I could focus more on understanding the content rather than constantly stopping to look up words. Another challenge in the basics was learning how to form questions and negations. In my native language, questions are often formed by changing the word order. But in English, you need auxiliary verbs like do, have, and will. For example, do you like pizza? Or I don't understand. At first, it felt awkward for me to create questions and negative sentences in English. I had to pause and think about the structure before speaking. But, as with other aspects of the language, it became easier with practice. I used simple sentences and repeated them until the structure became second nature. One of the most important things I learned during this phase of the journey was consistency. I understood that mastering the basics of English was not a one-time event. It was a daily commitment. Every day, I made sure to practice grammar, vocabulary, and listening. Even if I didn't feel like it, I would dedicate at least 15 to 30 minutes a day to studying. I also practiced speaking, even if it meant speaking to myself. The more consistent I was, the more I saw progress. During this time, I also found it helpful to seek support and guidance. I joined online forums and groups where learners of English could share experiences, ask questions, and give each other advice. These communities were incredibly helpful because I didn't feel so alone in my struggle. It also motivated me to keep going, knowing that other learners were facing the same challenges. Despite all of these efforts, I still struggled with some basics. Sometimes I would get frustrated with my slow progress or mix up grammatical rules. But I had to remind myself that learning a language takes time, and it's okay to make mistakes along the way. I learned that it was important not to get discouraged. Every small step forward, every new word I learned, every new sentence I could speak was a victory in itself. Overcoming the basics wasn't easy, but it was a crucial part of my journey. I knew that once I had a strong foundation, the rest of my learning would build on it. As I continued to improve, I began to feel more comfortable speaking, reading, and understanding English. It wasn't perfect yet, but I was moving in the right direction, and that was enough to keep me motivated. In the end, mastering the basics became the bedrock of my English skills. I learned to accept that I wouldn't get everything right immediately, but with consistent practice, things would eventually click. The more I immersed myself in the language and practiced daily, the closer I came to my goal of fluency. And this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to learn, but the basics had laid the foundation for everything that was to come. Chapter 4: Embracing Learning Methods. As I continued along my journey to learn English, I began to realize that learning a language is not just about memorizing vocabulary and understanding grammar rules. It's about discovering effective methods that help you absorb, retain, and apply the language in real-world situations. Over time, I found myself experimenting with different learning methods, and these methods became the key to my success. One of the first changes I made was to embrace a more active approach to learning. Early on, I was mainly focused on passive learning, listening to English songs, watching movies, and reading books. While these activities were certainly valuable, I realized that to truly improve, I had to be more proactive in how I engaged with the language. So I began setting more specific learning goals each day. Instead of simply watching an episode of a TV show in English and hoping I would absorb something, I began to actively watch. I would take notes on new vocabulary and phrases, especially idiomatic expressions or words I didn't understand. Afterward, I'd look them up in the dictionary, write them down in a notebook, and try to use them in sentences of my own. This active engagement helped me remember the words and phrases much more effectively. Alongside this, I embraced the method of spaced repetition. I'd heard about it from language learners online, and I decided to try it out for myself. The idea behind spaced repetition is simple. You review information at increasing intervals over time, which helps you retain it in your long-term memory. So, for vocabulary, I created a set of digital flashcards using apps like Anki. I would enter the word, its meaning, and an example sentence. Every time I reviewed the flashcards, I would be reminded of the words and see how they fit into real-life contexts. Over time, this method helped me recall words much more easily, and I could use them in conversations and writing without hesitating. But it wasn't just about technology or apps. I also made sure to integrate English into my daily routine. For example, every time I went to the grocery store, I would focus on the English names of the products. If I bought fruits, I would say the name of each fruit aloud: apple, banana, grape, practicing my pronunciation as I did so. It may seem small, but this continuous exposure to English throughout my daily life made the language feel more familiar and less intimidating. To reinforce my grammar skills, I started using grammar workbooks. At first, I found the rules difficult and confusing, but I soon discovered that a structured approach helped me understand the nuances of English grammar. I would focus on one concept at a time, such as articles, prepositions, or verb tenses, and practice it thoroughly before moving on to the next. Every time I made a mistake, I would go back and review the rule that caused the error. This repetition, combined with the practical exercises in the workbooks, allowed me to internalize the grammar rules and use them correctly in sentences. Additionally, I found that learning with audio and visual aids helped me reinforce the grammar and vocabulary I was learning. For example, I began watching English language YouTube channels that taught both English language skills and topics I enjoyed, such as travel, cooking, and science. These videos allowed me to see the language used in context, and I could hear how native speakers naturally use expressions and sentence structures. Watching YouTube videos with subtitles was especially helpful at first, but over time, I tried to challenge myself by watching without subtitles to improve my listening skills. Reading. Books in English also became a key component of my learning strategy. Initially, I started with children's books, like The Very Hungry Caterpillar and Where the Wild Things Are. These books had simple vocabulary, clear sentence structures, and illustrations that helped me understand the context of the story. As I built my confidence, I moved on to young adult novels like Harry Potter and The Hunger Games. These books were more complex, but they provided a deeper understanding of language usage, plot development, and character dialogue. Each time I finished a chapter, I would take note of any new words or phrases and look them up. This process helped me build my vocabulary and also improved my understanding of sentence structure. I also began to focus more on listening practice. At first, understanding native speakers was difficult because they spoke quickly and used idioms that I wasn't familiar with. But I realized that the key to improving was consistency. I set aside specific times each day to listen to English, podcasts, or audiobooks. I started with podcasts that covered simple topics, like The Daily by the New York Times, which helped me follow news stories in English. I would listen to these podcasts while walking, commuting, or doing chores around the house. As my listening skills grew, I began to participate in language exchange programs. These programs were incredibly beneficial because they gave me real-time practice with native speakers. I joined online groups where I could connect with people who were also learning English, as well as with native speakers who were eager to help me improve. We would have conversations on various topics, and they would correct my mistakes and offer suggestions on how to express myself more clearly. These conversations helped me build my confidence, and I learned so much from interacting with real people who were patient and supportive. One learning method that I found especially valuable was keeping a language journal. I made it a habit to write a few sentences each day, describing what happened during my day, expressing my thoughts, or writing about something I had learned. This not only helped me practice writing, but also allowed me to apply new vocabulary and grammar rules in a practical context. The more I wrote, the more comfortable I became with structuring sentences, and my writing started to feel more natural. Over time, I noticed that I was writing longer and more complex entries, and I was able to express my ideas more clearly and confidently. One method that I didn't expect to be as helpful as it turned out to be was learning through hobbies. For example, I've always loved cooking, so I started following English language cooking blogs and watching cooking tutorials in English. Not only did this improve my language skills, but it also made the learning process more enjoyable. I was learning new recipes, while at the same time practicing my English. I also started reading articles on topics I was passionate about, such as technology and travel, which kept my interest in learning alive and made the process more enjoyable. I experimented with these various methods. I began to realize that learning English wasn't about sticking to one approach. It was about finding what worked for me and being flexible. Some days, I focused on grammar exercises, while other days, I practiced listening and speaking. Sometimes, I would dedicate time to reading, and on other occasions, I would just relax with an English movie or podcast. The key was balance and making sure that I was constantly exposing myself to the language in different ways. One final realization I had was the importance of patience and consistency. I had to accept that learning English was a long-term process. It wasn't something I could rush, but I also knew that I had to be consistent if I wanted to improve. Even on days when I felt tired or discouraged, I reminded myself that small steps lead to big progress. Every word I learned, every conversation I had, and every book I read was a step closer to becoming fluent. In the end, embracing these learning methods not only made learning English more effective, but also more enjoyable. Each method helped me strengthen different aspects of the language, and together, they created a well-rounded learning experience. I realized that language learning is not just about working hard. It's also about finding joy in the process and staying motivated through the ups and downs. So, as I continue on this journey, I know that I can rely on these methods to guide me toward fluency. Chapter 5. Practice makes perfect. By now, I had learned that language learning isn't a simple process of memorizing vocabulary and grammar rules. It's a journey that requires consistent effort and dedication. I had gone through the basics, struggled with pronunciation, tackled grammar, and started building my vocabulary. However, I knew that all this learning wouldn't amount to much if I didn't start using the language regularly. I had to practice, and practice consistently, if I wanted to truly become fluent. The first realization I had was that learning a language is a skill, and like any skill, it improves with repetition. At first, I was a bit hesitant to speak English because I feared making mistakes. But I quickly understood that making mistakes was part of the process, and in fact, they were essential for improvement. The more I spoke, the more confident I became. I started pushing myself out of my comfort zone, seeking opportunities to speak English every day, even if it was just talking to myself or repeating what I had learned. One of the best decisions I made was to find language exchange partners. I joined online platforms where people around the world connected to practice languages. My exchange partner, a native English speaker, was incredibly supportive. We would talk about our daily lives, share stories, and discuss various topics, sometimes in English, sometimes in my native language. This made me feel less self-conscious because it wasn't just about making mistakes. It was about communicating and building a connection. Over time, I became less afraid of saying something wrong, and I found myself thinking in English more naturally. Speaking was a big challenge for me. I was shy at first, and I felt nervous every time I had to speak English. But I realized that I had to face this challenge head on. I made a rule for myself: speak as much as possible. Whether I was ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions, I made a conscious effort to speak in English. These small interactions helped me gain confidence and improve my speaking skills. Gradually, I started to feel more comfortable when speaking in longer conversations, even when I made mistakes. In addition to speaking, listening was another area where I had to put in a lot of practice. Early on, I found it difficult to understand native speakers, especially in fast-paced conversations. It was easy to get discouraged because no matter how much I studied, I still couldn't catch every word or phrase. However, I knew that listening is a skill that improves with practice, so I made it a goal to listen to English every single day. I started watching English TV shows, movies, and news broadcasts, paying close attention to how native speakers spoke. Sometimes I would watch the same episode or clip multiple times, focusing on different aspects each time: vocabulary, intonation, rhythm, or new expressions. I even began listening to podcasts during my daily activities like walking or doing chores. At first, I would listen with subtitles, but over time, I tried to challenge myself by watching without them. Slowly, my ability to understand spoken English improved. In the same vein, I realized that to truly internalize the language, I needed to read regularly in English. Initially, reading in English felt like a slow and tedious process. I would have to stop frequently to look up words, and sometimes I didn't understand the meaning of a sentence because of unfamiliar vocabulary. But instead of being discouraged, I kept reading. I started with simpler materials, like children's books, which had simpler vocabulary and sentence structures. These books gave me a solid foundation in basic English. As my confidence grew, I moved on to more challenging texts, like young adult novels, and eventually more complex materials like newspapers and magazines. The key to improving my reading skills was to make reading a daily habit. Each time I read a book or an article, I would write down unfamiliar words, look them up, and try to use them in my own sentences. I also tried to summarize what I read in English, which helped reinforce the material in my memory. As I continued this practice, I began to see a noticeable improvement in my reading comprehension. I no longer had to stop every few sentences to look up words, and I could understand more complex texts. Alongside speaking, listening, and reading, writing became a crucial part of my practice routine. At first, writing in English felt like a chore. I would struggle with how to structure sentences or express my ideas clearly, but writing regularly was one of the most effective ways to practice what I was learning. I started by keeping a daily journal. Each day, I would write about what happened during my day, my thoughts, or anything I had learned. The act of writing allowed me to practice new vocabulary, sentence structures, and grammar rules in a practical context. As I continued writing, I noticed that I became more comfortable with forming complete thoughts in English. My sentences started to flow more smoothly, and I was able to express myself with greater clarity. To make my writing even better, I would use grammar checking tools, like Grammarly, to spot mistakes and learn from them. This gave me immediate feedback, allowing me to refine my writing skills further. Over time, my journal entries became longer, more detailed, and more coherent. One key part of my journey to fluency was setting specific goals for myself. I didn't want to just learn English. I wanted to make measurable progress. So I set weekly and monthly goals, For example, one week I would focus on learning 20 new words, and the next week I would focus on mastering a specific grammar rule. These goals kept me motivated and provided a sense of achievement every time I met them. I would track my progress in a notebook, and seeing the improvements I made was incredibly encouraging. While I was doing all this practice, I also made sure to review regularly. The more I learned, the easier it became to forget things I had studied earlier. To avoid this, I set aside time every week to review what I had learned. I would go through my flashcards, read my journal entries, and review my grammar notes. This constant reinforcement helped me retain the knowledge I had gained, and I found that reviewing became a key part of my routine. At times, it was tempting to skip some of the practice. It felt like progress was slow, and I couldn't see the improvements as clearly as I wanted. But I had to remind myself that progress takes time. Learning a language is not about instant results. It's about steady, incremental improvement. And the more I practiced, the more natural English started to feel. There came a point when speaking in English didn't seem so intimidating anymore. I could have simple conversations without overthinking every word. Reading and writing became smoother, and I found myself thinking in English more often. By now, I had come to understand that practice truly makes perfect. Every bit of practice, whether it was speaking, listening, reading, or writing, added to my growth. The key was consistency. If I kept practicing every day, I would get better and better. Mistakes were no longer something to fear. They were simply part of the learning process. The more mistakes I made, the more I learned. Ultimately, the practice was not just about improving my English. It was about building a new way of thinking. Learning a language isn't just about learning words. It's about understanding how people think, how they express their emotions, how they share their ideas. As I practiced, I started to feel more connected to the English-speaking world. It was no longer just a language I was trying to master. It had become a bridge to a new world, full of opportunities. So, as I look back on this chapter of my journey, I know that consistent practice was the key to my progress. Each day I put in the effort, whether big or small, it contributed to the greater picture. And the more I practiced, the more confident I became in my ability to communicate in English. Practice, I realized, was not just the key to fluency. It was the key to success. Chapter 6: Building Fluency. As I continued my journey toward mastering English, I began to notice that I was becoming more confident in my abilities. However, while I could understand a lot more, I wasn't yet at a point where I could speak smoothly or effortlessly. The next step was to focus on building fluency, the ability to express myself in English quickly and naturally, without pausing to search for words or struggle with grammar rules. I had heard many experienced language learners say that fluency comes with time and consistent practice. But what exactly does building fluency mean, and how can you achieve it? I realized that fluency wasn't just about speaking quickly. It was about speaking naturally, with ease, and being able to participate in conversations without feeling anxious or stuck. To reach this level of comfort, I needed to step up my practice in new and more intense ways. The power of speaking regularly. The first area I focused on was speaking. At this point in my learning, I had a solid vocabulary, and my grammar was much improved, but I still hesitated a lot when I tried to speak. I would often find myself pausing to think about the right word or struggling to remember a grammar rule mid-sentence. To overcome this, I realized I needed to speak more, even when I wasn't fully comfortable doing so. I set a goal to speak English every single day, no matter what. At first, I practiced speaking alone, describing what I was doing or talking about my day. It felt a bit strange at first, speaking to myself in a language that I hadn't yet fully mastered, but it was helpful. I would practice narrating simple actions, like, "I'm making breakfast now," or "I'm reading a book in English." It was important for me to hear myself speak in English and get used to forming sentences without overthinking them. But just speaking to myself wasn't enough. To truly build fluency, I needed real-life conversations with other people. I joined language exchange programs and found language partners who were either native speakers or other learners who were eager to practice their English. Speaking with them, even for just 10 or 15 minutes a day, had a huge impact on my confidence and fluency. These conversations were invaluable because they forced me to think on my feet. If I didn't know a word or phrase, I learned how to explain myself or use synonyms to keep the conversation going. One key to fluency is confidence in speaking, and one way I built this confidence was by embracing mistakes. I had to let go of my fear of making errors, because I realized that mistakes were part of the learning process. When I made a mistake, my language partner would correct me, and I'd take that feedback and use it to improve the next time. The more I spoke, the more I learned to express myself more naturally, and the less I worried about making mistakes. Improving listening skills for fluency. Along with speaking, I knew that listening played a crucial role in building fluency. After all, language is a two-way street. If I could understand what people were saying, I'd be able to respond more quickly and naturally. At first, listening to native English speakers was difficult. They spoke quickly, used slang, and their accents varied from one person to another. But I kept reminding myself that fluency would never come if I didn't challenge myself to understand faster speech. So I started listening to more English podcasts, TV shows, and movies. At first, I used subtitles in my native language, but as my listening skills improved, I switched to English subtitles and eventually stopped using them altogether. I would listen to podcasts during my commute or while cooking, paying attention to the way people used phrases and expressions in everyday conversations. The more I listened, the easier it became to pick up on the natural rhythm and flow of the language. It was no longer about understanding every single word. It was about getting the gist of the conversation, understanding the context, and being able to respond in a way that felt natural. One of the most impactful practices I started was to shadow native speakers. Shadowing is a technique where you listen to a speaker and repeat exactly what they're saying, trying to mimic their pronunciation, tone, and pace. I would find short videos or clips of people speaking and repeat after them. Sometimes I would do this with actors in movies or TV shows I enjoyed. By trying to match their speaking style, I began to sound more natural in my own speech. Shadowing also helped me understand sentence structure and word stress, which were essential for speaking fluently, reading, and expanding vocabulary. Another important aspect of fluency is vocabulary expansion. Although I had learned many words by this point, I realized that to speak fluently, I needed to know more than just the basics. I needed to learn the words and expressions that native speakers use in everyday conversations. So I made a habit of reading widely, from news articles and blogs to novels and short stories. When I came across a new word or phrase, I didn't just look it up in the dictionary and forget about it. Instead, I made sure to use it in a sentence and try to incorporate it into my daily conversations. If I was reading about a topic that I was particularly interested in, I would find new words that were specific to that subject, expanding my knowledge while also increasing my fluency. For example, I started reading more articles about science and technology, areas I had a passion for. These articles introduced me to new technical vocabulary, and I made an effort to learn and use these words in my speech. Alongside reading, I began watching TED Talks and documentaries on topics I enjoyed. These sources were a goldmine for new vocabulary, especially terms related to specific fields. Listening to experts explain complex topics helped me expand my vocabulary, but it also exposed me to how more sophisticated sentences were structured. Writing for fluency. While speaking and listening were my primary focus, I knew that writing was also important for fluency. Writing allowed me to solidify my grammar and vocabulary, and it also gave me a chance to express my ideas more clearly. I had already kept a journal, but I began taking it more seriously as a tool for improving fluency. I made sure to write regularly, not just when I felt like it, but as a daily practice. I began writing essays on various topics, ranging from simple personal reflections to more complex topics like social issues and global challenges. I would also engage in online writing communities, sharing my work with others and getting feedback. This feedback was crucial because it allowed me to correct mistakes and refine my writing style. One of the biggest improvements came when I started writing without stopping. I set a timer for 20 minutes and wrote continuously, trying not to worry about mistakes or perfection. This practice helped me get used to expressing myself without hesitation. I focused on fluency rather than correctness in the moment, knowing that I could always go back and revise later. Writing this way helped me develop a smoother flow of thought and improved my ability to put sentences together more quickly. Thinking in English. One of the most important milestones in building fluency is learning how to think in English. At first, my mind would always revert back to my native language when I needed to express myself, and I would have to translate sentences in my head. This slowed me down, and it became frustrating. But as I continued to practice speaking, listening, and writing, I started noticing a shift. The more I immersed myself in English, the more I started thinking in English. I didn't have to translate everything anymore. I could just express my thoughts directly in English. At first, this was difficult, and I had to consciously make an effort to avoid using my native language. But over time, thinking in English became easier, and this made me much faster at forming sentences and responding in conversations. Reaching the point of fluency. As I continued practicing and improving my skills, there came a moment when I realized that I had crossed the threshold into fluency. It wasn't an overnight change, and it wasn't a specific event, but rather the accumulation of months of consistent effort. I could now speak with greater ease and confidence, listen to English speakers and understand most of what they said, and express my ideas clearly in writing. I no longer felt overwhelmed by grammar rules or vocabulary. Everything had become more automatic. Building fluency took time, but it was worth every effort. I had gone from struggling with basic sentences to confidently participating in conversations, watching English language media without subtitles, and writing longer, more complex pieces. Fluency, I realized, wasn't just about knowing a language. It was about feeling comfortable and natural when using it. no matter the context. As I reflect on this chapter, I know that the road to fluency wasn't easy, but it was a rewarding journey. Practice, consistency, and confidence were the keys that unlocked this level of proficiency. Now that I had reached fluency, I felt like I could truly use the language, expressing myself freely, understanding others, and continuing to grow in my mastery of English. Chapter 7: Immersing in English. By this point in my journey to mastering English, I had built a strong foundation in the language. My grammar had improved, my vocabulary had expanded, and I had gained a lot of confidence in speaking and writing. However, I knew that the next step to truly mastering the language was to immerse myself fully in it. Immersion is one of the most powerful tools for language learning, and I realized that if I wanted to reach a higher level of fluency, I had to surround myself with English in as many ways as possible. The power of immersion. Immersion involves surrounding yourself with the language so that you are constantly exposed to it, not just in lessons or formal study, but in everyday life. The idea is that the more you interact with the language, the more natural it becomes. Immersion is not just about practicing. It's about living the language. It's about incorporating English into your daily routine so that it becomes a part of you, just like your native language. I began by thinking about ways I could integrate English into my life in a natural, meaningful way. I wanted to go beyond the classroom and textbooks. I didn't want to just learn English. I wanted to live it. So, I started by changing the language settings on my phone, computer, and social media accounts. Every time I checked my phone or logged into social media, I was exposed to English. This constant exposure was a simple, yet effective way to immerse myself in the language. But I didn't stop there. I knew that immersion meant not just using English in simple ways, but also interacting with it in more complex and varied contexts. So, I decided to watch English TV shows and movies regularly. Watching TV in English wasn't just about entertainment. It became a tool for learning. I started with shows that I enjoyed, like Friends, The Office, and How I Met Your Mother. These shows were not only fun, but they also helped me get familiar with everyday conversational English. At first, I used English subtitles, as this allowed me to match spoken words with their written form. However, after a while, I started watching shows without subtitles, which forced me to focus more on understanding spoken English. I would repeat scenes, pause, and rewind when I didn't catch a word or phrase. This was challenging, but it helped me improve my listening skills and get used to different accents, colloquialisms, and expressions. I learned that language isn't just about textbook grammar and vocabulary. It's about how people communicate in real life, how they speak casually, how they joke around, how they express emotions, engaging with English content. In addition to watching TV, I also began to read more in English. I realized that if I wanted to reach a higher level of fluency, I needed to read regularly, not just in a passive way, but actively, seeking out content that was interesting and challenging. I started with articles from websites like BBC, National Geographic, and Medium, which covered a wide range of topics, from current events to science, technology, and culture. These articles introduced me to new vocabulary and idiomatic expressions, while also expanding my knowledge of various subjects. As I became more comfortable reading, I moved on to more complex materials, such as novels and academic papers. I began reading novels that I had always wanted to explore, but in English. I picked up books like The Great Gatsby, 1984, and Pride and Prejudice. These classic novels provided me with rich language and exposed me to different writing styles, sentence structures, and vocabulary. They also gave me a deeper understanding of culture, history, and the context in which the language evolved. Also made a habit of reading English blogs and listening to podcasts. I subscribed to podcasts on topics that interested me, everything from business and personal development to history and pop culture. I found that listening to podcasts was an easy way to immerse myself in English while doing other activities, such as cooking or exercising. Listening to real people talk about their experiences, ideas, and perspectives gave me a sense of how English is used in different contexts, whether it's formal, informal, technical, or conversational. Surrounding myself with English. To take immersion even further, I decided to surround myself with English-speaking people. I knew that actively engaging with others was crucial for improving fluency. I joined language exchange groups where I could practice English with native speakers or other learners. These language exchanges gave me the opportunity to converse with real people, get immediate feedback, and ask questions about phrases or words I didn't understand. At first, it was intimidating to speak with native speakers. I worried about making mistakes or not being able to understand everything they said. But I soon realized that language exchange wasn't just about speaking perfectly. It was about communication, getting the message across, even if you made mistakes along the way. I started having regular conversations with language partners, focusing on improving my speaking and listening skills. It became easier over time, and I even made friends through these exchanges, which made the process feel less like a task and more like an enjoyable experience. I also looked for opportunities to immerse myself in English-speaking environments. This meant attending events, conferences, or meetups where English was the main language. Sometimes these events were formal, like seminars or workshops, and other times they were casual gatherings where people from different countries met to discuss shared interests. These settings helped me practice my speaking skills, while also giving me insights into the culture and nuances of the language. Living in English through hobbies. To keep things fun and engaging, I found ways to immerse myself in English through my hobbies and personal interests. For example, I've always been interested in cooking, so I began to watch English language cooking shows and read recipes in English. Not only did this help me expand my vocabulary related to food, cooking, methods and ingredients, but it also made learning more enjoyable. Every time I tried a new recipe, I was learning new words, phrases, and expressions while doing something I loved. I also started exploring English content related to my other passions, such as science and technology. I would read articles, watch documentaries, and listen to podcasts on these topics. This allowed me to improve my English while also feeding my curiosity and interests. The more I engaged with content I enjoyed, the more natural and effortless it became to absorb new words and expressions. Traveling and immersing in real-life contexts. While immersion can be achieved in many ways from home, I knew that there was no substitute for real-world immersion. So, I decided to travel to English-speaking countries to immerse myself in the language even more deeply. Traveling gave me the chance to practice speaking in real-life situations, whether it was ordering food at a restaurant, asking for directions, or engaging in casual conversations with strangers. Being surrounded by native speakers 24/7 forced me to think in English more and more. I no longer had the option of translating everything into my native language. I had to understand everything in context and express myself directly in English. The immersion experience was intense and sometimes challenging, but it was incredibly rewarding. It allowed me to put everything I had learned into practice and really see the progress I had made. Reflecting on immersion. Looking back, I realized that immersion was the key to my fluency. It wasn't just about learning grammar rules or memorizing vocabulary. It was about living the language every day, surrounding myself with it in every aspect of my life. Immersion made the language feel less like something I had to study and more like something I was naturally a part of. It allowed me to see how language is used in the real world, to hear how native speakers communicate, and to practice speaking without fear of mistakes. One of the most important lessons I learned during this phase was that immersion takes time and effort, but it is one of the most effective ways to improve. The more you expose yourself to the language, the more natural it becomes. At first, it may feel overwhelming, but the more you engage with English, the easier it gets. Whether it's through watching shows, reading books, talking to people, or exploring your interests in English, immersion creates a deeper connection to the language and accelerates fluency. As I continue on this journey, I know that immersion will always be a central part of my learning process. It's no longer just about studying English. It's about living it, thinking in it, and embracing it as a part of my daily life. Immersion is what has truly brought me closer to becoming a fluent English speaker, and it's what will continue to push me forward as I strive to master the language. Chapter 8: Pushing Through Obstacles. As I continued my journey to master English, I began to realize that the path to fluency isn't a smooth, uninterrupted ride. Along the way, I encountered many obstacles, some big, some small, but each of them tested my resolve and challenged my commitment to learning the language. At times, these obstacles felt overwhelming, but I knew that the key to success was not in avoiding them, but in pushing through and finding ways to overcome them. This chapter is about the obstacles I faced, how I dealt with them, and what I learned from them along the way. The first major obstacle: pronunciation struggles. One of the first major obstacles I encountered in learning English was pronunciation. At the beginning of my journey, I had a solid grasp of vocabulary and grammar, but when it came to speaking, I struggled with the sounds. English, as I quickly learned, isn't always phonetic, and many words don't sound the way they look. Words like though, through, thought, and thorough confused me endlessly. The subtle differences between long and short vowel sounds seemed almost impossible to grasp. I remember getting frustrated every time I tried to speak. I would practice words over and over again, only to find that I still couldn't say them correctly. I thought, how can I ever communicate effectively if I can't even pronounce the words right? There were moments when I felt like giving up because it seemed like my pronunciation was never going to improve. But instead of letting frustration win, I focused on small, consistent improvements. I started listening to native speakers as much as possible, whether in TV shows, podcasts, or YouTube videos, focusing intently on how they pronounced words. I used apps and online tools that allowed me to listen to words and repeat them. I also started recording myself and comparing my pronunciation to that of native speakers. Though it was awkward at first, I stuck with it. Slowly but surely, my pronunciation began to improve, and I started feeling more confident in my speaking. The most important lesson from this experience was that perfection isn't necessary, but progress is. Every time I got a word wrong, I didn't beat myself up. Instead, I used it as an opportunity to learn. With patience and perseverance, my pronunciation improved over time. The second obstacle, grammar confusion. As I progressed in my learning, another obstacle I encountered was grammar. English grammar, especially the tenses and structure, felt like a maze to navigate. I often found myself mixing up past, present, and future tenses, and I struggled to get the word order right in certain sentence types. I remember feeling frustrated when I couldn't express myself clearly because of a grammar mistake. For example, I'd often say, "I have gone to the store yesterday," instead of, "I went to the store yesterday," and it sounded wrong, but I couldn't quite figure out why. This confusion often left me feeling discouraged. The grammar rules seemed endless, and every time I thought I had mastered one concept, another challenge popped up. There was a point when I felt like I would never be able to use the tenses correctly, and it seemed like a huge obstacle in the way of fluency. But again, I realized that small steps would lead to big progress. I focused on breaking down each grammar concept into manageable chunks. I didn't try to learn everything at once. Instead, I focused on one rule at a time. Whether it was mastering the present simple tense or understanding the past perfect tense, I used online exercises, watched grammar tutorials, and asked for help from native speakers during language exchanges. Each time I made a mistake, I noted it down and reviewed it later, learning from it. Eventually, I reached a point where grammar didn't feel like an obstacle anymore. It became second nature to use the right tense in the right situation. The key was consistency, making sure I practiced a little bit every day, even when I didn't feel like it. The third obstacle, overcoming self-doubt. One of the toughest obstacles I faced wasn't about the language itself. It was about my self-doubt. I often wondered if I was ever going to be fluent, or if I would always feel like an outsider when speaking English. I doubted myself every time I made a mistake, thinking I was too far behind to ever catch up. I felt anxious in conversations, afraid I'd say something wrong and embarrass myself. This self-doubt led to fear of speaking, which became another barrier to my progress. I found myself avoiding speaking as much as possible, making excuses, not to practice with others, and opting for listening or reading instead, where I felt more comfortable. But I soon realized that this fear was holding me back. Speaking was the only way to improve, and I couldn't let fear stop me from making progress. To overcome this, I had to change my mindset. I started by reminding myself that making mistakes is part of the learning process. No one speaks perfectly, not even native speakers, and everyone has their own journey. I pushed myself to speak more, even if it was just talking to myself or recording videos of myself speaking in English. Slowly, I began to feel more comfortable with the process. I joined language exchange groups and focused on communication, not perfection. The more I spoke, the more my self-doubt lessened, and the more confident I became. The biggest breakthrough came when I realized that confidence comes from practice, not from being perfect. The more I put myself out there, the more I saw that others were patient with me and appreciated my effort. Overcoming my self-doubt was one of the most empowering parts of my journey. The fourth obstacle: staying motivated. There were also times during my journey when motivation was hard to maintain. Learning a language is a long-term commitment, and there were moments when it felt like the progress I was making was too slow. I would look at my friends or peers who spoke English fluently and feel like I would never reach that level. It was easy to get discouraged when it felt like I was stuck in a plateau, not improving as quickly as I had hoped. During these moments, I had to remind myself of the bigger picture, why I started learning English in the first place. I focused on my goals and remembered the reasons why I was committed to learning. I set small, achievable goals for myself, like learning 5 new words every day or completing a chapter of a book in English. Each time I reached a goal, no matter how small, it motivated me to keep going. I also celebrated my progress, even when it felt minor. I took pride in the fact that I could now have simple conversations in English or understand a movie without subtitles. These small wins added up, and they reminded me that every step forward counts. Another helpful strategy was mixing up my learning routine. I switched things up to keep my studies interesting, whether it was watching a new English show, listening to different types of podcasts, or reading a book in English that was outside of my usual genre. By staying curious and finding new ways to learn, I was able to reignite my passion for the language. The key to overcoming obstacles. What I learned through these obstacles is that every challenge is an opportunity to grow. Each obstacle I faced was difficult at the time, but it forced me to adapt, try new strategies, and ultimately become stronger in my language learning. The obstacles weren't just roadblocks. They were part of the journey that led me to where I am today. The key to overcoming obstacles is persistence. It's about not giving up even when things get tough. Every time I faced a challenge, I chose to move forward, whether it was through extra practice, seeking help, or changing my mindset. Overcoming obstacles taught me resilience, and now I feel more confident in my ability to face future challenges. As I continue to learn English, I know there will be more obstacles ahead. But I also know that I have the tools, the mindset, and the determination to push through them. The journey isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Every challenge I overcome brings me one step closer to fluency, and every obstacle I face only makes me more determined to succeed. Chapter 9: The Road to Mastery. As I reflect on my journey of learning English, I realize that I've come a long way. From the first hesitant steps, barely knowing how to form a sentence, to now, where I can confidently speak, read, write, and understand English with ease. It feels like I've crossed a monumental threshold. However, the path hasn't been linear. It hasn't always been smooth, and there were many bumps along the way. The road to mastery in any skill, and especially in a language, is long and winding, but it's also incredibly rewarding. The first milestone: building a solid foundation. When I first started, I had no idea how challenging learning a language would be. The basics felt overwhelming: pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, and even understanding the cultural nuances of the language. I had to start with the very foundations, learning the alphabet, mastering basic grammar rules, building a core vocabulary, and getting used to the sounds of the language. In the early stages, I focused heavily on the essentials, learning words I'd need for basic communication and understanding how sentences were structured. At that time, it seemed like a huge task. I was learning small chunks of information, and at times it felt like the road to fluency was too far ahead. However, I soon realized that this was only the beginning. Every small step, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was building toward something much bigger. Slowly, the language began to feel more natural. I remember the first time I had a conversation in English with someone. It wasn't perfect. I stumbled over words, made mistakes, and felt self-conscious. But I was proud of myself. I had started to move from the theory of language learning into the real world, using the language in real-life contexts. That conversation, even though imperfect, marked the first real step toward mastery. The next challenge: overcoming plateaus. Once I reached a basic level of competence, things didn't automatically get easier. In fact, I found myself hitting a plateau. It was a period when I felt like I wasn't improving as much as I had been earlier. My grammar was better, my vocabulary was more expansive, and I could understand a lot more. But there were still moments when I found myself unable to express complex ideas or keep up with fast-paced conversations. It was frustrating, and I started to question whether I would ever truly master the language. But I quickly realized that this plateau was a normal part of the language learning process. It's common for learners to experience periods of stagnation, and the important thing is to push through. I knew that if I wanted to continue improving, I had to go beyond my comfort zone. I couldn't just rely on the basics anymore. To continue my progress, I needed to immerse myself even more deeply in the language. I set new goals for myself, goals that challenged me to engage with more complex material and push my limits. I started reading more advanced texts, such as novels, academic articles, and nonfiction books. This exposed me to more sophisticated vocabulary and sentence structures. I also began watching TED Talks and listening to podcasts that were more technical or intellectually stimulating. These materials pushed me to engage with more complicated ideas and language, which in turn expanded my vocabulary and understanding. Most importantly, I began seeking out more conversations with native speakers. Instead of staying within my comfort zone of speaking with other learners or using basic English in everyday situations, I started actively looking for opportunities to speak with fluent speakers. I joined discussion groups, attended events, and even traveled to places where I could practice English with locals. It was nerve-wracking at first, but I knew that this was the only way to break through the plateau. The more I spoke with native speakers, the more I learned to adapt to their conversational flow, their slang, and their accent. Pushing beyond. Comfort zones, the real test. As I started to break through the plateau, I faced another challenge: adapting to more spontaneous and dynamic conversations. While I had gotten used to having planned, slower-paced conversations, I found myself getting overwhelmed in fast, spontaneous exchanges. Native speakers often spoke quickly, used slang, and sometimes dropped words that I wasn't used to hearing. This was especially true when I was interacting with people in casual settings. The key to overcoming this challenge was to stay calm and remind myself that mistakes were okay. I didn't need to understand every single word to get the gist of the conversation. I focused on context, tried to pick up on nonverbal cues, and learned to ask questions when I didn't understand something. I realized that language wasn't just about the words you use, it was about communication. If I couldn't catch something, I could always ask, or I could paraphrase what I thought was being said and keep the conversation flowing. One of the biggest breakthroughs for me was learning to think in English. Early on, I had to translate everything in my mind before I spoke, and this slowed me down. But after months of practice, I started noticing that my mind would form sentences in English without needing to translate them. I would wake up in the morning and find myself thinking in English, planning my day, and even dreaming in English. This was a sign that I was starting to internalize the language. My brain was beginning to treat English as a natural mode of thinking, not just as a set of foreign words I had to consciously work with. Expanding vocabulary and idiomatic understanding. Another part of the mastery process was expanding my vocabulary. At the basic level, I had learned the essential words needed for everyday life. But to truly master English, I needed to learn more nuanced expressions, idioms, and slang. English, like any language, is full of expressions and phrases that don't always make literal sense. Phrases like kick the bucket or under the weather don't translate easily, but they are a fundamental part of the language. Understanding and using these idiomatic expressions made me feel more integrated into the language, allowing me to sound more natural and fluent. To improve in this area, I started watching English language movies and TV shows with a focus on the slang and informal speech used by native speakers. I would make a list of idiomatic phrases and expressions, look up their meanings, and practice using them in my own conversations. Over time, I was able to incorporate these expressions into my speech, and they became part of my natural vocabulary. This was one of the final pieces of the fluency puzzle for me. Being able to speak naturally and understand the subtleties of casual conversation. The road to mastery. Continuous learning. As I moved further down the road to mastery, I realized that language learning is a lifelong process. It's not about achieving perfection, it's about continuous improvement. I'll never stop learning English, and that's what makes it so exciting. I still come across new words, expressions, and cultural references that I don't understand. But I now have the confidence and the tools to keep learning and improving. I also realize that mastery isn't just about knowing the right words or speaking without an accent. It's about communicating effectively. Mastery means being able to express yourself clearly, understand others, and connect with people from different cultures. It's about using the language to explore the world and build relationships. For me, mastery is also about embracing the journey. It's easy to get fixated on the end goal, but I've learned that the process of learning itself is what makes the experience worthwhile. Every conversation I have, every book I read, Every movie I watch in English is another step toward deeper mastery. It's a journey that never truly ends, and that's okay, because it means I'm always growing and evolving. Reflecting on the journey. Looking back, I see how much I've changed since I first started learning English. The language is no longer something I study. It's something I live, breathe, and use every day. The challenges, obstacles, and plateaus that I faced were all part of the process, and they made the journey all the more rewarding. As I continue on this path, I know that the road to mastery isn't a straight line. There will always be new challenges, new things to learn, and new goals to set. But I'm ready to keep moving forward, because I know that each step brings me closer to fluency, and mastery is within reach. Chapter 10. Consistency is key. As I approach the final stages of my journey toward mastering English, I couldn't help but reflect on what had gotten me to this point. The long hours of studying, the countless hours of listening, reading, writing, and speaking, all of it had contributed to the progress I had made. But there was one overarching theme that had carried me through the highs and lows of my learning journey: consistency. From the very beginning, I realized that learning a language wasn't something I could do sporadically. It wasn't about binging on a week of study and then taking a break for a few months. The key to becoming fluent wasn't about working hard for short bursts. It was about making consistent, incremental progress, no matter how small. Consistency, I learned, was the driving force behind all my success. The power of small daily efforts. At first, the idea of learning English every day seemed daunting. I thought, how can I keep this up for months or even years? There were days when I felt tired, uninspired, or overwhelmed by the sheer amount of material I still needed to cover. But I quickly realized that it wasn't about doing everything at once. It was about showing up every day, even if it was just for 15 or 20 minutes. Small, consistent efforts added up over time. I started to create a daily routine where I would practice English every day, no matter what. Some days I would focus on grammar. Other days I'd practice vocabulary. And on other days, I would have conversations with native speakers or watch an English movie. The important part wasn't the specific activity. It was the act of doing something every single day. Even on days when I didn't feel like studying, I made it a habit to spend at least a few minutes listening to English, reading an article, or jotting down a few sentences in my journal. I noticed that over time, this daily practice began to build momentum. It wasn't about spending hours at a time. It was about staying engaged with the language consistently. I also made sure to mix up my learning activities, keeping it interesting and engaging. If I found myself getting bored with one aspect of learning, I would switch it up and try something new. This helped me stay motivated while keeping my routine fresh. Setting achievable goals. Consistency also meant setting realistic goals. At the start of my journey, I often felt overwhelmed by the amount of material I needed to learn. But rather than trying to master everything all at once, I started breaking my goals into smaller, manageable tasks. For example, instead of saying, "I want to learn English fluently," I set smaller, achievable goals like learn 5 new words every day. Write at least 1 paragraph in English each day. Have a 10-minute conversation in English 3 times a week. Watch a 30-minute English video without subtitles once a week. Each of these goals was something I could realistically achieve, and they helped me stay focused. By breaking down my bigger goal into smaller chunks, I felt like I was making constant progress, even if it didn't always feel like a huge leap. Each time I met a goal, I felt a sense of accomplishment that kept me motivated to keep going. One of the most valuable lessons I learned about consistency was that even when progress felt slow or invisible, I was still making headway. Learning a language is not a race. It's a long journey, and consistency makes that journey more manageable. The key is to keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps may seem. Overcoming setbacks with consistency. Despite my best efforts, there were times when I encountered setbacks. I'd struggle with new grammar rules, have difficulty keeping up with fast-paced conversations, or forget words I had learned. During these times, it was easy to get discouraged. I would look at my progress and feel like I was stuck. But I learned that setbacks are a natural part of the process, and the best way to handle them was to keep going. Instead of letting setbacks derail my progress, I turned to consistency to pull me through. I would remind myself that learning a language is a long-term commitment, and a temporary setback doesn't mean I had failed. For example, when I struggled with a specific tense or found myself forgetting new vocabulary, I simply took a step back, re-reviewed the material, and continued practicing. Whether it was repeating the same grammar exercises or revisiting vocabulary lists, I stayed consistent in my efforts. I also learned that consistency didn't mean perfection. It meant persistence. There would always be days when I felt frustrated, when I made mistakes, or when I didn't have the energy to learn. But on those days, I would remind myself that a little bit of practice is better than no practice at all. Even if I only managed to review 5 new words, or listen to a podcast for 10 minutes, that effort was still progress. Over time, I began to see the impact of small, consistent actions. Even when I felt like I wasn't improving as quickly as I hoped, I could see the results of my consistent work. My speaking became smoother, my listening improved, and I began to understand more complex texts. My confidence grew because I had made English a regular part of my life. Consistency in real life. Practice. One of the most important ways I practiced consistency was by integrating English into my daily activities. I stopped seeing English as something I only studied during certain hours of the day, and instead, I made it part of my routine. For example, when I was commuting, I would listen to an English podcast or audiobook. If I was watching a movie, I would make an effort to watch it in English with English subtitles, trying to catch new words or phrases. I also made it a habit to engage in conversations as much as possible. Whether it was talking to a friend, participating in a language exchange, or even chatting with strangers online, I practiced speaking every day. At first, I was nervous, and I would make mistakes, but over time, those conversations became easier. Speaking regularly helped me solidify what I had learned and gave me the confidence to express myself more freely. I also set aside time each week to review what I had learned. Reviewing vocabulary, grammar, and sentence structures helped me retain the material and feel more confident in using it. I often went back to older materials to see how much progress I had made and to refresh my memory on things I might have forgotten. This review process made sure that everything I learned stayed fresh and accessible, even if I wasn't actively studying it. Staying motivated with consistency. One of the biggest challenges in maintaining consistency is staying motivated. There were times when I felt like I wasn't making enough progress, or when I was tired of the effort it took to learn every day. But I found that motivation didn't always come from big breakthroughs. It came from small wins, the little successes that added up over time. Every time I learned a new word, finished a book in English, or successfully had a conversation, I felt a sense of accomplishment that kept me motivated. I also made sure to celebrate my progress, no matter how small it seemed. Every milestone was an achievement. Whether it was understanding a conversation without having to ask for clarification or finishing a chapter of a book in English, I recognized and celebrated those victories. Acknowledging progress, no matter how incremental, helped keep my motivation high and reminded me why I was on this journey in the first place. Looking ahead. The lifelong journey. As I reflect on how far I've come, I realize that consistency is not just a short-term strategy. It's a mindset that will carry me throughout my entire language learning journey. Even though I've reached a high level of fluency, I know that there will always be new challenges to overcome, new vocabulary to learn, and new ways to improve. The key to continued success is maintaining that consistency, showing up every day, no matter what. For anyone learning a language, my advice is simple. Stick with it. The road to fluency is long, but consistency is the glue that holds everything together. Whether you practice for 15 minutes a day or an hour, the important thing is to make it a habit. The effort you put in today will pay off tomorrow, and each step forward, no matter how small, brings you closer to your goal. Great work today! Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.